Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me another episode. I am the host of the podcast Learning from Leaders. And on this episode, what I wanted to talk about is really how do we bridge the divide that's happening right now between employee engagement and organizational excellence? We hear so much right now about the great resignation. And while certainly we can't deny that, 4.5 million people in November, I think, quit their jobs. It's not as though they just didn't go anywhere else. They went other places. And I would argue that the great resignation in some regards is a myth in that I believe certainly over my experience over the last decade and certainly more recently is that the same number of people have been quitting their jobs. The difference now is that in the past they quit or they quit intellectually and emotionally. They just didn't physically leave their jobs. And I think it's probably been only through the pandemic that we're starting to see that people, for whatever reason, they have either gotten to a point where they're just fed up with it and they said, you know what, I'm going to try and do my own thing. I'm going to try and be an entrepreneur. Or there have been enough other opportunities out there that they're looking for new avenues, for new jobs, and they've finally had the courage to leave wherever they are, or they've retired early. But this idea that somehow people haven't thought about quitting before November or October or September, I think is crazy. It's just that we've finally gotten to the point where people, I think, have the courage or they've found the opportunity that they're going to go somewhere else. That said, I think it's even more important for leaders and for organizations to recognize that the way they led before, the behaviors that are necessary, I think, in terms of leading in this new environment have changed. One of my favorite quotes is by a philosopher named Eric Hoffer, and he once said that in times of change, learners inherit the earth while the learned find themselves perfectly suited for a world that no longer exists. And I fully believe that those that are not open or willing to look at their own leadership behaviors and how they lead and find ways to develop those or improve those, you're going to be left holding the bag. I think it's as simple as that. You will not be as effective. And I think organizations under so much more stress right now that unless they have people that are engaged, that are on board, it's going to be much more difficult to, I think, to reach that level of organizational excellence. Not to say that you can't do well, but I would argue that you're not going to do as well as you could if you behaved in ways that people were engaged when they showed up for work. I remember not many years ago, I was working for an organization. The CFO of that organization had horrible behaviors, was very disruptive, very disrespectful to those people that reported to him. And we were talking about emotional intelligence. I was working with his team. We were talking not only just about emotional intelligence, but what behaviors created a better environment and got people to really follow your lead more effectively. And his response was, I get what I want with my current behaviors. I couldn't disagree with that. I mean, they had a group or an organization that was doing well, but as a CFO, somebody that was looking at return on investment, I could argue that he wasn't getting the best return. And just like any other investment that he was going to make within an organization, if employees are our most valuable asset, then he really was, by his behaviors, almost damaging his most valuable asset by his behaviors. He was lucky to be getting the production that he was getting, and I think more because at that time, those people probably felt as though they had fewer options available to them in terms of leaving that organization. So how do we do this? What can we do to bridge this divide? Well, one more piece to think about in regards to teams. I do a lot of work with the 5 dysfunctions of a team, Pat Lencioni's book, through DISC. And through DISC, it's an assessment that we do, which actually was created by Patrick Lencioni, called the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. And what we do is we look at all 5 of those levels. Because organizations, right, first, if you don't have trust, it's very difficult to be a successful organization. If you don't have trust, then you oftentimes don't have real conflict. and we need conflict. In DISC, we call it productive conflict. And a lot of the work that I do around that is how do you create productive conflict? We need conflict. That's how we improve. That's how we get better oftentimes. The problem is that we have conflict in ways that we become difficult on each other and not on the problems. Whole different ballgame. But if we don't have real conflict, then oftentimes we don't have real commitment, because people will either back away because they don't want to get into a conflict, so they don't do anything, right? So they will go along with it, but they haven't committed to it. And that's, to me, a lack of engagement. So the next one is the fourth dysfunction, is around lack of accountability. It means that we don't hold each other accountable. And I don't even like the word accountability, because oftentimes I think when we hear the word accountability, we think it's punitive. There's something that's going to be done negatively to you to show you that you are going to be held accountable. We need ownership. And that's part of that bridging the divide between employee engagement and organizational excellence. It's about behaviors that create or cross that bridge, or cross that divide, I should say. But the last dysfunction that we talk about at the top one is inattention to results. And within an organization, that's really the people that are showing up that are just trying to get through the day. That's 2/3 of employees almost. If you look at work by Gallup or Press Ganey, probably the most popular ones that do a lot of the engagement surveys that I run into, we'll talk about how 1/3 of employees are engaged. 2/3 of employees are disengaged. More importantly, there's a lot of research that would suggest that 70% of that disengagement is the direct result of the person that they report to, right? That's a lot of responsibility or liability on one person, all based on their behaviors, the manager or the leader. That's why we talk about cables as an approach to building better bridges. That is how we cross that divide between employee engagement and organizational excellence, is through behaviors. And the model that I use is called cables. And if we think about this in terms of the Golden Gate Bridge, that one cable that runs tower to tower on the Golden Gate Bridge is about 3 feet in diameter. But in actuality, if you were to do a cross section of that, you'd find that it's about 27,000 individually wrapped cables. To me, that's no different than our relationships, right? The more we behave in certain ways, we're building cables. And the more we behave in ways that are positive toward stronger relationships, that's what happens. Those become stronger. Just like with the Golden Gate Bridge, if I were to cut 100 cables on that bridge, there are so many there that structurally it's not going to impact the integrity. Now, those need to be repaired, obviously, but the bridge is not going to collapse. And again, it's the same thing with our relationships. If we have behaved consistently enough, long enough, we've built a strong relationship or leadership bridge, and we cross it every day with each other. The more we build on this, the more cables, these 6 behaviors that I'm going to talk about, the stronger this bridge becomes. So when we talk about cables, the first cable in this, the C, is around congruence, and it's all about walking the talk. Is what I say and what I do the same thing? Because when they're not, when I'm out of alignment with what I say and what I do, we build distrust. We can't have a strong bridge when that happens. A world event that's going on right now, I think the Prime Minister of Britain, Johnson, right? There was just an article about how he had all of these lockdowns, right? The British people were under all of these lockdowns, yet there's an email going around about how they were having a bring your own booze party around Christmas for 100 people. There's a lack of alignment there. And we see it with our own politicians in this country where that can happen, right? We set up these restrictions about gatherings, and then you find a picture of a politician that was at, an event without a mask or, whatever, just completely going against what they're trying to make everybody else do, right? It's this rules for thee, but not for me. And when we do that, we cannot build trust. Another example of that was an organization that I was working with that had a physician that was very disruptive and had a number of people leaving that department. And the argument was that they couldn't really deal with this, the leaders of this group, because this physician brought in so much revenue for the hospital. They were afraid to get rid of this person or to address it because, there was, if they lost this person, they would lose significant revenue. Well, that may be so, but what it says to everybody else in the organization is basically the values that we have that are around respect and integrity and compassion and collaboration for each other, they don't matter if you bring in $4 million in revenue a year. You get to do whatever you want, right? There's a lack of alignment there. So the next cable that we move on to is around appreciation. And this has two parts. It recognizes people for who they are, but also for what they do. And in this environment, we hear so much right now about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I would say that appreciation hits on the diversity part of this, because that recognizing people for what they do or for who they are is that part. It's recognizing diversity on our team. That's so important. Who people are, not just various races and religions or sexual preferences, whatever it might be. We all have different backgrounds. We all have different histories. And the more we're able to open up and appreciate the differences that we have, we create diversity. Now, the other part of appreciation is recognizing people for what they do. And I think in this environment, so many people have put in so many hours in their roles that have gone unnoticed because people are just trying to navigate getting through this, right? That we haven't taken time to take a step back and appreciate all that people have done in terms of staying focused and showing up for work. We need to do more of that. And there's an acronym that I use within that called RPMs. Just like in your vehicle, you have RPMs that tell how efficiently the vehicle is running. If your RPMs run too low, the vehicle stalls. That's like not recognizing people enough. That becomes disengagement in organizations. But the flip side of that is that when we recognize people too much, or I shouldn't even say too much, but in ways that are seem insincere, maybe employee of the month, employee of the week, just telling people they do a great job, but people just feel as though that's a tool that's manipulating them to try and get them to do more. We miss opportunities. There are real opportunities to recognize people, and we need to do that. And I think the three things that you can use to gauge that is, one is make sure that how you're recognizing people, that it's unexpected, right? It's not always on Thursday that somebody gets recognized, so they're expecting it. It happens whenever it needs to happen. Also, that it's meaningful to the person, right? That if I have an employee that doesn't play sports, doesn't like to go to sporting events, and as recognition, something special, I gave them 2 tickets to a local basketball game, one of our semi-pro teams. That's not going to land very well, right? Because it's not meaningful to them. The third thing that you want to do is you want to make it specific. So again, it's not you do a great job. It's the other day you did this, and I want to thank you for that, or tell you what a great job you're doing because of this example, something specific. So the next behavior in cables, the next piece of this bridge that we're building, is around belongingness. Now, we talk again about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Belonging is about the inclusion part of this, that we're herd animals. We need each other. If there's another thing that's been seen over the last 2 years, is there's been so much isolation. It really has negative impacts on all of us when that happens. I think people are less tolerant toward each other when we are more isolated, because we're not around people that are different from us, right? Part of that appreciation, but also we just don't have the connection with people that we need. Belonging is incredibly important if we're going to bridge that gap between employee engagement and organizational excellence. That employees, when they show up, by my behaviors, need to feel as though they're valued, right? And they're part of where this organization or this team is going. Next, we move on to the behavior of listening in our cables model. That's the cable of listening. This one is, I think, one of the most important, but also can be one of the most difficult. And we talk about listening in this regard in four different ways. One is we listen with our eyes, right? We look for facial expressions, we look for body language, um, we look for how a person is standing. These are important things to recognize that as we're trying to read other people, is what they say and maybe their body language, is it congruent? Is it the same? So next we listen with our ears, right? So we're listening for tone of voice, um, the words that somebody might be using, the pace that they're speaking in. Is it sarcastic? Is it angry? Those are important things to recognize and to pick up on. I can do a very simple example of saying, I didn't take your book. But if I say, I didn't take your book, you can probably think that it means that I didn't take it, but somebody else did. I know that. Or if I say, I didn't take your book, it could mean I borrowed it, but I didn't take it. Right? And the last is I didn't take your book could mean, yeah, I didn't take your book, but I took your computer, I took your wallet, I took something else, but it wasn't your book. It's the same sentence, but how I stress words in that changes the meaning of it completely. That's why that's so important. Now, the next is listening with our mind. And this is about being curious. This causes or relies on us to be silent and to pause, right? And to question, is what somebody's saying really what they mean? Or am I taking this the wrong way? What else might be going on here? Rather than just jumping to conclusions, maybe I'm going to clarify. You know what, Jim? This is what I think I heard you say. Is this what you mean? Right? I'm going to clarify that. So important for us to do. And then lastly, the fourth part of the listening component of this is we listen with our hearts. And really, that's about listening with empathy. It's about trying to imagine, if I was the one that was involved in this conversation, how would I want somebody to listen to me? How would I want this other person to listen to me? Now, think about this. If you listen in all four of those modes, it's going to be very difficult for you not to make a connection with somebody, even in conflict, or to try and start to see things from their perspective, because those in and of themselves require that you do that, right? Especially listening with your mind and listening with empathy. To do those things opens things up. Now, this doesn't say that you necessarily have to change your viewpoint, but it's to say you're probably going to have a much better opportunity having a real dialogue with somebody else. And I will tell you that there are so many times that I can recall when what we thought was a disagreement in some of the work that we've done, we find out after people have had an opportunity to talk about things and there's a curiosity that's been demonstrated, we find out that what the concerns were that the other person had were easily addressed. And even if they weren't easily addressed, they were able to be addressed in a way that allowed for collaboration, not even win-win, but really collaboration where both walked away feeling as though they didn't necessarily have to give up anything to gain agreement, but that they almost came up with a solution together, all because they were able to listen better toward each other. So the next one is around empathy, and that stands by itself. We certainly hear much more about empathy today, although I do think that there is still this um, thought at times that empathy somehow is weakness as a leader to be empathetic. And it's the opposite. To demonstrate empathy is one of the greatest strengths that you have, because it takes courage to do that. It also takes courage to say to somebody, you know what, I was wrong, or I'm sorry, or I don't know the answer. Again, I think as leaders, we think, well, we got to have all the answers or people aren't going to follow us. We never have all the answers. There's more credibility. That bridge becomes stronger when the person knows, you know what, this person's just like me. They make mistakes. They don't always have the answers. It opens up other people to be more open to coming to you when they don't have the answers, because they know you've admitted to it as well. And it builds a stronger bond in terms of them following you, because they know that when you're focused, when you are directed in a certain way, that you're confident you know where you're going. It wins on both sides. The last behavior that we build here is around specifics. That's the S cable in our model. And that's about clear expectations and about accountability or ownership, as I like to call it. So the first part of this is we need to have clear expectations with each other. Just like our values within an organization, what do we stand for? As an organization, what are our values? Those need to be clearly stated because when they're not, individuals in the organization may not know what's our mission? What are we meant to do here? Or if it's a relationship between a leader and a follower or a manager and an employee, what do we need from each other? What do I expect from you? And what can you expect from me? Very important. The other part of this, though, is even when we have clear expectations, we need to have ownership or productive accountability, as I will call it. I think accountability, when we hear that word by itself, oftentimes conjures up images again of retaliation or of punishment. And that's not the best way for us to move forward or develop the strongest bridges. It's about ownership. When we have that, right, we have the clear expectation, but we also have the ownership to that clear expectation. Our bridge becomes complete at this point. Now, as well with this bridge, it's not as though we have to start with the C and go to A as the next building material. It becomes fluid. We will just generally do these. And as well, when you start to have issues that might come up with people that you work with, as a tool, what I would often use or do use is this is a troubleshooting guide that I can look at cables and say, which behavior in this model is not being satisfied right now? What am I responsible for that I'm not doing that's creating some of the problem? And notice I didn't say what's the other person not doing right because they may be not online with all of the cables pieces, but that's not where I need to start. I need to start with me first because the better I am at understanding what role do I play, what responsibility do I have in the challenge or the conflict that I'm having right now, the more likely I'm going to be to have the other person open up to looking for a solution to the conflict that we're having. It's not going to be by me going to them and saying, hey, you know what? You're not doing a very good job of listening, or, you haven't really been very good about appreciating me for what I've been doing. It doesn't work that way, at least not most effectively. So that's it. We have 6 cables that build this bridge. We cross it every day, whether it's professionally or personally. We're building relationships by our behaviors, and our behaviors are these cables. You can think about it as you are the architect, the engineer, and the builder of your relationships, your bridges. And the more you behave in ways that are productive, that are congruent, that demonstrate appreciation, that create belongingness, that show that you really are invested in listening, that demonstrate empathy and that set clear expectations through specifics and ownership, you will build the best, strongest bridges available without question. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope you'll have an opportunity to test this out yourself. Take a look at some of your relationships and maybe question which of the cables do I need to work a little more on? Is it congruence? How am I going to build this bridge that crosses this divide so that my employees are more engaged? Because if that's true, then what you're going to see is your organization is going to become better. And we need more of that today. So again, take a moment, ask yourself what cables would make your relationship stronger, and go out and do it. I promise you, if you focus on rising above your best, you will have better relationships. Till our next episode, I'm wishing you all the best.